For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with something that we have been excited about for a while. We have been getting to know Michelle Manook. She's the CEO of FutureCoal. FutureCoal is the rebranded World Coal Association. So we're going to talk about coal today in a global perspective for all the reasons that it's important to energy, but we're going to cover the angles from the environment to geopolitics. Let me just pause and say, Michelle, we're so delighted to have you, to get to have this conversation. We have enjoyed getting to know you and your team, and we're just super pleased to have this conversation today.
Thank you for having me and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, it's going to be great. Mike, the markets have been lots going on lately. What would you tell us before we jump in with Michelle about the markets today?
Yeah, Maynard, we're going to talk a lot about what has happened since Trump was elected president, but today it looks like a little bit of volatility in the market. The Dow's down about 200 points, and it's because the 10-year yield's up about 10 or 12 basis points today, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But first off, since a week since President Trump was elected, I just want to give you a sense for where the bond market has gone, equity markets, commodity markets, energy markets, et cetera, et cetera. And so from a bond standpoint, the 10-year bond has increased from roughly 4.25% on Tuesday to about 4.5% today. As you know, last week the Fed cut their interest rates by 25 basis points from 5% down to 4.75%. The U.S. dollar has had a rally here. It's up about 2.5% over the last week. And I think the reason why bonds are rallying, obviously we have the CPI tomorrow. I think most people are expecting 2.6%. Maybe people are thinking there's going to be a little hotter CPI print tomorrow. And then the following day, there'll be the PPI print. But like I said, the 10-year is up. And I think the overriding reason is I think people think that, with these inflationary aspects of tariff increases by the Trump administration, less regulations means higher real growth. And I think most people think that there are going to be bigger budget deficits. And so I think that's why we've seen bond yields, go up since Trump was elected. The second thing is on crude oil. WTI is down about $4 since last Tuesday. It's gone from roughly $72 down to $68 a barrel. And I think the reason it's doing this is because I think Trump has decided he's probably going to want some sort of a peace agenda. So I think he's going to immediately move to sort of get peace in the Middle East, maybe peace in Ukraine. He's always talked about this drill, baby, drill. I don't think that's going to work very effectively because, as we know, most E&Ps, oil majors, they're all returning capital. They're not going after production growth. So I think that's going to be less of an argument, but it's a great slogan out there. And I think the other thing is you offset that is I also think that Trump is going to move for Iranian oil sanctions pretty early in his presidency. And so if we have that, thinking about that, Biden under his presidency, exports from Iran went up about 1 million barrels. Under Trump, they were down about 1.5 million barrels. And so if you take 1 million barrels off the market, that can easily be supplemented by Saudi and UAE, who have probably 3 to 4 million barrels of spare capacity. So I think it's kind of balanced that way. From an equity market standpoint, I mean, it's just been straight up and to the right. You've seen broader markets, that being the S&P, the Dow, the NASDAQ, they're all up around 4 or 5%. The Russell 2000's up around 7%, which is a good thing because we're seeing some of that, performance being spread out to broader equity markets, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, and you've also seen, Bitcoin is up around 30% because people think that Trump's going to be very positive towards Bitcoin. So that's a huge move. Bottom line is, it looks like most equity markets from a technical standpoint are overbought. And so it wouldn't surprise us in the least if we do see some pullback here in the next couple of weeks. I don't think there's reason for a significant pullback, but it's just had a humongous rally on Trump. And so, probably does pull back. From an energy standpoint, it's interesting is that the energy sector over this time frame is up around 5%. Oil services has been the leader. It's up around 10%. E&Ps are up around 8%. Refiners up, 4%. U.S. oil majors, midstream, about 2 or 3%. The interesting thing is alternative energy stocks, the ICLN, that's down around 10 to 12%. And so that's been the major losers. And the reason we wanted to mention this is because it's not as intuitive as you think it is. The interesting thing is under the Biden presidency, alternative energy was down 60%, and the S&P energy sector is up around 150%. So 210% outperformance by traditional energy. Under Trump's first presidency, alternative energy was up roughly 300%. The energy sector was down roughly 30%. So alternative energy outperformed by almost 330%. So it's not as intuitive as you'd think. A lot of these, alternative energy stocks have been beaten down, and they may stay beaten down for a while. But I mean, I think it's maybe an opportunity to really be thinking about segmenting, understanding which stocks you really like that really have good business models, because I think there's some opportunity here. So we'll kind of leave it there. The last thing we'd say is that this week started the COP29 conference in Baku. And so that is ongoing. I say the tone of this conference versus COP28 is going to be a little bit different. So that's kind of where we're, how things are, faring right now. Maynard, like I said, it's been up to the right. We do expect there's probably going to be a pullback because it's been a big outperformance. So we'll just leave it there.
Okay, awesome. Arjun, I know you've got some thoughts coming into this one. What's on your mind, my friend?
Maynard, I too am really excited to talk about coal today. It's one of those topics that I think in our world, which is admittedly can be US, Canadian, European focused, oil and gas, as well as some new energies. There's always a lot of debate. What's the outlook for oil? What's the outlook for natural gas? Are we going to peak oil and gas in some upcoming year? Our view, of course, is that there's no decade, let alone year, where we can know where oil or gas demand is going to peak. And at the same time, we do expect growth in new energies. All that debate that we spend all of our time on often takes granted the outlook for coal. And we've spent some time in Super Spiked writing about this, as well as on CBT talking about it, is there's this presumption. I would say both amongst energy analysts, oil and gas company executives, as well as climate and environmental oriented people, that it is a given that coal demand is going to decline in the coming decades. All of those net zero forecasts, while we spend a lot of time debating oil and gas and the ramp of new energies, they all assume that it is all but going to be a straight line down for coal demand, starting within the next 5 years and then out to 2050, when there is exactly zero evidence that, especially in the rest of the world outside of mature areas like the United States and Europe, that coal demand will be doing anything other than growing. We have the example within 25 years of a 1 billion person scale economy in China that has essentially doubled global coal demand from the expectations. They are now about half of global coal markets. And why is that? It is a large, abundant, available domestic resource. It's inexpensive, it's local, it is jobs, taxes, bureaucracy. It's avoided oil imports, it's avoided natural gas imports, and we have the example of China. You've got another 1 billion person scale economy that is just about to start ramping up, or it's in the early stages of it, India. They also have a lot of coal. And my question for everybody, whether you're a climate activist or an oil and gas executive or anything in between, why do you think they're not going to be using growing amounts of coal? And what is the role for coal in our future energy mix? There is a presumption from everyone outside of energy circles, traditional energy circles, that it is going away when there is exactly zero evidence it is. And I say often, it's reasonable to debate the outlook for oil, even though if I think it's going to grow. It's reasonable to debate the competitiveness of LNG, even though I think it's going to grow. The commodity with the most certain growth outlook, I'm going to argue, is coal. Because when billion person scale economies have a lot of it, the idea that they're not going to use it when they're using a fraction of the energy overall that we do is simply a preposterous assumption. And so in that spirit, I couldn't be more excited to speak with our guest today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Maynard.
Well, awesome. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Arjun, and thanks, Michelle. I think, Michelle, one place I would probably jump in is we've been doing this podcast discussion for next spring, Mike. I think it'll be 5 years. And coal, as important as it is to the energy complex of the world, shame on us. It is woefully underrepresented in those conversations. And so thank you for helping us solve that, if you will. Well, maybe jump in, Michelle, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about FutureCoal, just so people understand the organization a little bit better and how you guys spend your time and kind of what some of your key messages are.
Yeah, look, thank you again for having me. It was really great to hear that introduction as well, and perspectives from other people. Look, FutureCoal, as you said at the beginning, is the rebranded World Coal Association, but it's a lot more than that. It's effectively now a global alliance for what we call sustainable coal, and I'm sure the discussion will get a little bit more into that. We're a multilateral platform. We represent now the global coal value chain, so that's a little bit different from where the World Coal Association started, which was very much about the producers of coal. And our mission is really just to ensure that coal is actually understood. And as we all know, particularly in this conversation, and I'm sure many of your, your listeners will know this, that coal is actually more than just coal power. Coal's tentacles go far and wide beyond. It's a critical input in many different industries, whether that be steel, cement, aluminium, chemicals. And so I think, people actually don't have this understanding. And FutureCoal is really there to actually talk about that total contribution of coal, to educate, to increase, I guess, what we call the coal IQ. And then really to position a thing that we regard as a sustainable coal stewardship type philosophy, which is really educating, again, advocating what the opportunities are for the coal value chain to contribute both economically and environmentally, because many people don't appreciate the technologies and the innovation that exists that actually allows coal to legitimately participate, not just in any kind of energy transition. And we'll talk a bit about that a little later, because I don't actually talk too much about energy transition. I think it's far more responsible for us to talk about energy addition. So let's remember let's peg that and remember to come back to that, because I think that's important. But yeah, sustainable coal stewardship is really about educating through our FutureCoal platform what that opportunity is to extract more value per ton of coal. And there are certainly nations like China, like India, that are already embraced this kind of philosophy and advancing it. So yeah, we are very much not in denial about climate change. In fact, all of our members sign up to that. We also sign up to something that we believe is about responsible coal principles. And that's really understanding that we must have a much more balanced view and pragmatic view of how we actually approach both economic and environmental outcomes. So that's quite key to the platform.
Michelle, maybe I could ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. What drew you to get involved? Like, why did you see, what got you excited about taking on this role and then taking on this mission? Because it's a unique one, and we love hearing about it. But I just think understanding how you thought about it, from a career standpoint, is really an interesting thought.
Yeah. Well, I remember when the International Search Agency brought the role to me, I remember thinking, what have I done wrong in my career? Like, I've always, where did I go wrong in all of that? It was actually probably one of the best searches that I've been involved in. It took 6 months of due diligence. And what I did is really, I read a lot. But I also went, to the coal face of many of the nations, both in developed and developing markets, and had a look at everything they did and their aspirations. So, I visited places like China, looking at coal innovation. I visited places like the US, where actually a lot of coal innovation has emanated from. I went upstream to the mines. I went downstream to customers. It was an all-encompassing education. And I think probably the biggest reflection for me, even though I was an executive with 25 years in resources, mining, oil, gas, is I didn't understand coal. I didn't really appreciate the tentacles that was coal. And I guess the second part of that was, it was really quite clear that when you had the facts were quite compelling. It almost didn't make sense that we were fighting against this incredible resource that could actually be abated, that could be a legitimate participant, in any energy transition. And I guess the last bit, which was very personal, was it was a really interesting time in my life. I have a wonderful father who's been a great mentor, and I'm an ethnic girl, who grew up in Australia, but I was born in Pakistan, and we experienced and we understood, all things about the privilege of living in a country like Australia, with power, with water, with education, with good health. And, I was talking to my dad about this, there was a couple of opportunities to look at. And he just reminded me that I was at a point in my career where I could actually do a job that meant something, and that coal meant something to the world. And maybe I should go and communicate that. And that was it. I think to do this job, certainly for the last 5 years, I've actually needed that, that personal commitment to it. But I feel now that it's been such an important journey for me personally and professionally, but it's also taught me a lot about the importance of factual information, having an unemotional debate, and I think and making decisions and advising key decision makers in a way in which someone has to really have the best interests of mankind at heart in these really critical decisions that we're making, and I think all of those things are really important and compelling, and so I took on the challenge. It was not easy, and there have been many moments where I question a lot of things, but again, if you come back to the facts, if you recognize the importance of the resource, if you understand why it's needed, not just for poverty alleviation, but just for our modern life, and if you stay close to those things, it's really compelling, and you've got to sort of stand up and listen and speak out and be brave about it, I guess.
That was just the nicest couple minutes I've heard in a long time. It was just great. I wanted to throw out a question to you. When we think about coal in our interactions and kind of conversations, it seems like one of the biggest things that's missed about coal, besides how much we use and all those things you were touching on, is how much cleaner a modern coal plant is compared to one of 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Like just how much the industry, because there's always this quote, people will say stuff like, well, the Chinese are putting up this many new coal plants, and they suggest that, do it in a way to suggest that all those emissions are going to be, so terrible, but they're just losing the capabilities of modern coal. Would you mind talking about that? Just how much better the technology is today?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, no, look, I think one of the failures, and I think as an industry, as a coal value chain, we have to put our hands up and say, we haven't done ourselves any favors in not communicating this. But pretty much every person who has a negative view on coal doesn't actually understand abatement technologies and doesn't understand that new coal plants are not going to be, the subcritical plants of yesterday. There's advanced, high efficiency, low emission technologies. Japan's running the most efficient coal fleet in the world. So is China, and India is fast looking at it. So that's actually quite important. It's also important to stress that in combustion of coal, which is where a lot of the issues and a lot of the pushback around coal and coal power is, that up to 99% of emissions from coal can be abated. And so that, CCS is an opportunity for coal power, and people need to understand that. And that looking at, some of those other issues around SOx, NOx, particulates. There are technologies today that really minimize that in very, very profound and material ways. And also looking at the efficiency of coal and heat power, the ability to actually get two energy sources. But, you know, that sort of efficiency, those sorts of opportunities actually are all part of minimizing the environmental impact and co-firing and all sorts of other tech. And so that's just in the combustion stage alone. And if you go upstream, there's many more things that are happening in terms of, you know, electric vehicles, AI, digitalization, the way we manage subsistence. You know, there's many more modern practices. And then if you go beyond combustion, you're really looking at, well, what can I do with coal waste? How can I make that, you know, how can I turn that to high value products? How can I look at coal to hydrogen, blue hydrogen? So, you know, there is this, I guess, a complete ecosystem, which is very much how India and China look at coal. And even to some degree, you know, we see Japan looking at coal and hydrogen and, you know, beyond just traditional power. So there are, you know, here are three nations that are really looking at how do we harness and how do we expand this potential in coal through technology. And these technologies exist. They're tested, they exist, they're here today, they can be deployed if, you know, if policies, both government and funding policies, you know, apply a level playing field to it. And I think, you know, that's probably quite important. So when people say to me, coal can't be clean, I say, yes, it can. But it really requires us to open our minds to what those possibilities are. And it's not just a one size fits all solution, which is, as we know, is a bit about how the debate, particularly around the energy transition, has unfolded. It's really important to understand that, you know, in India, for instance, it's very, you know, their coal gasification is a big part of their journey and their policy towards self-reliance. And these sorts of initiatives are very, very important, and also are, you know, they have a benefit, but it may not be seen in a simplistic way, the way we've kind of reduced this debate, which is all about carbon. But actually, the other nations look at coal and those technologies in ways in which it's about waste management, recycling, an entire ecosystem. And I think that's really the difference, you know, in the way those nations in particular are approaching, and not just in the way in which they're approaching it, but in a way in which other nations are actually now standing up in support. So funding or some kind of, you know, knowledge transfer support to really kind of expand this modernization of the value chain.
If you don't mind, just one thing before we leave this area, there was so much great stuff in there, is so if you just took a basic new coal plant, but, you know, without the bells and whistles of CCUS or any of these, you know, the coming technologies, you just took what we're really capable of doing right now, and you compare that to a plant built, you know, a legacy plant. Can you just help us understand just how much cleaner those, just what's that math, whether it's, you know, greenhouse gas emissions or however you think about it? Just want to illustrate this point. We find it really interesting.
Yeah, so you're getting now with the best supercritical technology up to 49%, you know, efficiency and effectively that, you know, that resonates in a very profound, you know, emissions reduction way. And I think we actually did a piece of research with the ASEAN Center of Energy, where if you actually invested $26 billion in upgrading a coal plant to ultra supercritical, you effectively reduced and then took that same 26 billion and then actually applied that to an offshore wind, you know, an offshore wind type, I guess, a plant, an offshore wind plant. I don't think that's the right word, but in effect, you would reduce, for the coal plant that you upgraded with that same investment, you would reduce annual emissions by 60 million tons of CO2, which is in effect 31.5 million cars per year off the road. And if you did that same investment on that offshore wind plant, you would only reduce annual emissions by 35.8 million tons of CO2, which is equivalent to around 18, 19 million cars. So it can be profound, that type of investment. And when we think about the trillions of dollars that we've invested in renewables plants that we know is not 100% credible solution for, to replace, whether it be nuclear or whether it be coal or whether it be gas. I mean, because reliability is actually quite critical and important, as is affordability. So when we know that, and we know that those technologies exist, it sort of does beg the question, why have we not really tried to upgrade some of these subcritical plants, in the world, when we can, and we know it would have immediate effect.
You were referencing, Michelle, as you took us on, some of your thoughts there, that just R&D and investing and technologies and just researching how to do coal better. Maybe help us understand from the outside looking in, where is a lot of that research being funded? Who does it? Is it done in a consortium? Which governments are providing support for that research? Like, where is the capital of that research, if you will? Both location and money.
Yeah. Well, look, I think very much, obviously, the government of India, the government of China, and to some degree, I guess, Japan, they do prioritize technology, and particularly coal tech. They look at it, beyond that. I think, sadly, some really great organizations, whether they've come out of the US, and mostly it has come out of actually the US, some of this great, but most of those, players have stepped away from coal and because of, pressure, shareholder pressure. And I think that's incredibly sad. I mean, GE has some of the best technology in terms of, high efficiency, low emissions. And its position it was one of our members, and then and then it wasn't, unfortunately, because it took a position to step back. So I would say that the investment now is very much with, being facilitated by government, by the governments that are embracing the opportunities around coal and particularly technology. But I really hope that, we'll start to see some of the other players come back in. Where those people, including, the emerging developing markets, want to have the diversity of innovation technologies to choose from. They don't want to always have to go to one provider. And I feel that it's quite important now. And this is really a big part of my push back into North America, where we really encourage some of these key players. Because, there are universities in the US that are studying all sorts of things about coal and coal beyond, beyond combustion, in terms of coal to rare earth, coal to critical minerals. All of these things are all innovation and technology based, and a lot of it has emanated out of some really amazing thinking in the developed markets who use coal for a number of years, whether that be the US or Europe. So unfortunately, we have to bring these players back. We've got to find a way to encourage them to be brave and speak about the importance of coal, and the innovation that's there that legitimizes its involvement and its future. And I think that's quite important that we do that. But the diversity of that available tech is actually really key to our future members who are really looking to be able to engage with many players and not just one particular nation or two, in being able to deploy any form of technology, within their own nation.
Michelle, it's really timely having you on the show today, especially since the COP29 conference in Baku started this week and will be going on for the next couple of weeks. And before I get to my question, I just wanted to note that at last year's COP29 conference, there was an agreement to phase out unabated coal by 2030 in OECD countries, and also an agreement to stop new coal investments. Also, we now have a new U.S. president in Trump. We have Scholz of Germany, likely headed toward a vote of confidence. And we have EU leaders like Macron of France that are not going to be showing up to COP29. So my questions are, what do you expect to be accomplished at COP29 with this current political backdrop, especially in relation to coal? Meaning, do you think parties will continue to double down on the phasing out of unabated coal by 2030? Also, do you think investors are thinking about investments in new coal, that it could be pushed to the right? And finally, do you think we'll be seeing an acknowledgement at this COP conference that the coal discussion needs to be more practical, especially given that China and India, two of the largest biggest coal consumers in the world, could have a more prominent role, a more prominent seat at this COP conference and in future COP conferences?
Well, it's such a good question, and it's really quite interesting. Obviously, I've been involved with the COP since this role for 2019, and we've been very active. You have to say, and we as the world would have to thank the government of India, who really took a leading role. And there was no coal, phase out coal. Then there was a lot of wordsmithing around it, but we've really pushed the phase out of unabated coal, which is pretty much the discussion that we've just been having, which is, what are the opportunities for coal to really be legitimate? So that was really where we kind of landed last year, which is the phase out of unabated coal. Of course, the most important word in that goes missing, which is unabated coal. It's not phase out coal, but that is actually what was intended. But the other thing that's quite important is to go back to the original origins of Paris, where it was all fuels, all technologies. And unfortunately, in Western Europe, the idea that the only definition of abatement being, CCS or CCUS is just unrealistic. We have to have a much bigger definition of abatement, and certainly FutureCoal always reminds people that efficiency and energy efficiency, and we've just talked a bit about that in terms of, high efficiency, low emissions plants. That is a great contributor to what we're trying to achieve in terms of emissions reduction. And so any efficiency is important. So I do believe that because we're seeing the dawning here, people are asking different questions now. You told me I was going to have cheap energy, but I don't. My bills are really, really expensive, so please explain. You told me that this has a low environmental footprint, but it doesn't. Please explain. So I think and we've always said this, certainly from FutureCoal's perspective, and even as we've engaged with COP, that the reality is really important. When the International Panel on Climate Change tells you that there is no 100% credible renewable solution today, then why are you still pushing that as the only solution? And so as we all kind of wake up to the reality of that situation, and as it becomes harder to ignore, I think those conversations will become more realistic. And then the other great response to that is I've seen an increase in the number of finance and investment, traditional investors contacting me for what are those opportunities for coal, seeking to understand. And as you know, many of those, particularly the top, I think it was the top 4 or the top 3 fund managers in Climate 100, actually stepped back or retracted their positions on it. So we're now actually starting to see some of that softening in coal policy as well, or fossil fuel policy, which almost seems ridiculous that we're here and we're talking about it. But I do think it's going to be, there's still a lot of reputations and there's still a lot of money at stake. You know, people have really gone out and very strongly and very emotionally about what they believe is the right and only path. But the reality is the reality. And I don't think, you know, there's going to be many more COPs where you can ignore the reality. And I think at some point, and this is what we try to do every single time we participate, is remind COP of the origin. And the origin was all fuels, all technologies. The origin was we would support countries at different starting points. The origin was there was no denial of climate change, but we all had to get on the path in a way in which served both our economies and our environment. And we had to do that together. And I think, and also the money that's been committed to a lot of these emerging developing nations has never been paid, because it's, you know, it's, and so all of these things don't create a mix of warm, you know, warm, soft and fuzzy, harmonious discussions, which is disappointing, because again, you know, I think the origins of Paris were in its sentiment, in what it was trying to achieve, what was correct. So we turn up, we participate, we always expect, you know, someone to slap down coal, but it is getting harder, I think, to deny the facts. And I'm not saying we're there, there's still a lot of opposition, but I think it will be a much more real conversation. And I feel like people, like, you know, 5 years ago when I started, you know, I was I probably could count on this hand, you know, one of a few people speaking globally in support of coal. Now there are many more people feeling a lot more confident to speak on those facts. So I can only hope for COP that the conversation continues to become more realistic, and we trace the heritage of why we all started on this journey together, and we kind of, you know, we find a way back to the foundations of what we were all trying to achieve.
You know, Michelle, I think it's a great segue to what I wanted to talk about, which was the geopolitics of coal supply. And so in oil markets, where we spend a lot of our time, it's become very apparent what a miracle shale oil and shale gas has been to changing geopolitical dynamics, where we can have wars in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, or the Middle East, Israel and Hamas, and have almost a negligible impact at this point on oil markets, because the US, previously by far the largest world oil importer, is now a slight net exporter. It's dramatically changed geopolitical security, affordability, availability. Europe, which had Russian gas cut off, was met entirely by, or overwhelmingly by, the advent of US LNG exports, which didn't exist, by the way, about 10 years ago. So this whole geopolitical dynamic that even if people aren't the biggest fans of shale oil, they've come to at least grudgingly accept how important shale oil and gas has been. And my question is really the degree to which this applies to coal. To me, one of the big advantages of coal, if you're China or India, is that it's something you don't have to import. You can more or less, with some modest exception, produce it domestically, and that is jobs, that's taxes, it's avoidance of imports of other commodities. Is it relevant? Is it important for the US, for Australia, for Canada, to have vibrant coal industries? Or because perhaps our domestic coal consumption has gone down dramatically for a variety of different reasons, and maybe that'll reverse in Europe as they're facing more expensive energy. But is it relevant? Is it important to have globally diversified coal supply? Or is coal one of these commodities where if you're going to use it, one of the reasons you use it is because you have a lot of it domestically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a fascinating space. I said to my board, I think it was now 3 years ago, that coal was on 4 journeys. The first was brand coal. You know, we were being vilified. We were misunderstood. You know, we lowered the coal IQ. The next one was new coal versus old coal. This is where, the traditional coal company is not going to look the same. It's going to be an innovator. It's going to look at verticals and horizontals, and it's probably going to connect itself more, to the value chain than it ever did before. Whereas, you're not just going to be seen as a producer or a consumer or a supplier. The third one was actually geopolitical coal, where I thought it was really important that we recognize that the nations who were really pushing anti-coal were developed nations, most of which, with the exception of the US, who still, I was reminded of this, just recently, still has 400 years of coal resource. So, and imagine what you could do with that. If you just had some innovation and thought process around it. But yeah, geopolitical coal, where the two nations who really are relying on coal and have a real thought process around technology, innovation, circular economy, being India and China, are actually quite, comfortable saying we need this. They're balancing both, economics and their environmental obligations. There's no blindness to that. They have the same commitments, but they actually prioritize energy security. They prioritize economic development. They're prioritizing competitiveness, international competitiveness. And I think, that is really critical. And the last journey is about FutureCoal, and I actually put that as a question mark. And obviously, our members are really embrace that, because we believe there is a future for coal, and it will go beyond power. There'll be a beyond combustion story for coal, whether that be hydrogen, critical minerals, ammonia, whatever it might be. But there'll be a bigger beyond combustion story for coal to be told. And I think this is actually quite interesting also to look at the alliances that are forming and shaping behind this kind of leadership that China and India are showing across coal. And I think it's also important to state that these are countries that are looking at also diversity. China is not just looking at coal, it's looking at nuclear. It's looking at all sorts of things. It's not just wedded to one particular, way of doing business. And I think this idea that they're really prioritizing security, both energy security and economic security, because that's that's key drivers to self-resilience and what they seek to achieve. So my personal view is that we ought to be looking at the geopolitics of coal and who are the players supporting these other players. Certainly on my platform, there is much more interest from BRICS nations. That doesn't mean that developed nations shouldn't be part of the platform. In fact, the platform has actually worked out that we really had to be neutral. We couldn't really lean into the geopolitics, because our overall ambition and objective was really to serve humankind with this critical resource called coal. But I think it's important, where people shy away from coal, to acknowledge that other players will enter that space who are not as uncomfortable with actually dealing with those facts and supporting those nations, on that path. So I appreciate it. I may not have answered it directly.
Well, let me just jump in and try it a slightly different way. It is remarkable that in 2019, as part of a primary process, Vice President, not then pre-Vice President Harris, said she was against fracking. And by the time we got to this presidential debate, she basically had to disavow that position. And it speaks to an acceptance of shale oil and gas and an appreciation for how critical it is for abundance, affordability, reliability, and geopolitical security. Is there an equivalent in coal? Because I otherwise think of it as primarily a domestic resource for China and India. Is there some similar catalyst, a crying out for energy demand from countries, perhaps in Africa, perhaps other parts of Southeast Asia that do not enjoy China and India's abundance of coal, who say we do want Australia or US to be part of that solution? Because otherwise those industries are under massive pressure. And whether Trump is going to be president or someone else in the future, it's hard to imagine a period where we have the type of calling out for coal like we do for shale oil and gas. And there's no way it's acceptable to be for banning fracking when we all now appreciate how important. Is there an equivalent on coal that can motivate, or are we really talking about how do we ensure that China and India have healthy coal industries to meet their demand? And we can debate carbon capture and how clean coal is and so forth, but it really is just a China and India thing.
Yeah. No, look, I think there's still an enormous amount of importing of coal, whether that be met or thermal, for both China and India. So that's still quite important to remember. But certainly a lot of emerging developing markets and other markets, look to coal. There's good coal from Colombia. There's good coal from South Africa. People want that diversity of supply. That's really important. There's good coal from Australia. All of these things are quite critical. But I think what I'm seeing a lot more now is where there are now countries, and of course Russia's a big supplier of coal as well, where there are countries now, when they look at their supply contracts, they're also looking at what are the other things we can do together. That really support this value chain of coal. How do I get better technology in? So it's not just necessarily a straight supply contract per se. Now we're looking at how do we actually come together and share the opportunities and the challenges that we all have around coal. And I think this conversation around supply security has been really important. And I guess even the conversations, and I won't say too much about it, but certainly as I work with all the governments, the conversations around, seaborne trade and really making sure that they don't feel like they're in a volatile situation. So certainly a lot of the events that have happened over the last, 3 years have really had people, particularly the downstream, the customers, thinking about upstream. Like, how do we actually control our supply a lot more? And the alliances that are forming there, are really very much, in many ways, BRICS. You can see a lot of the BRICS nations sort of emerging to support each other across that value chain. And that's that's a little bit about new coal versus old coal, and how the traditional company, a steel player now, doesn't want to just buy its coal. It's going to go and own its mine. It's going to mine its coal. And so I think, and more of this is happening, and those players are emerging from China, from India, from Indonesia. So I think this is really quite fascinating for, to watch what's going on in coal. Whether it, I don't know what level of impact it will have, in the near term, but I certainly see in the long term, it really will change the nature of coal in the market and the way certainly those nations perceive coal, in terms of that self-reliance, that security that they seek, both economically and, and environmentally. And just one last thing, one of the most important things about the US and its amazing journey on gas was how competitive it became. It became so competitive. And when I was on, when I did a roadshow, I think it might have been mid last year, it might have been early last year, Capitol Hill, we had an enormous conversation with many of your constituents about international competitiveness and, the role of energy in that. That is so, that is just fun. That's the fundamentals, isn't it? Like abundant energy, low price, all equals, a very good potential for the economy. And so I think it's almost like we have to go back to those fundamentals. Let me just say right now that the likes of China and India have never left those fundamentals behind. And in fact, they're probably more acutely aware of it.
Michelle, I think we're going to have to take that last 90 seconds and make it a video postcard, and we're going to send it to Europe. We're going to say, hey, don't forget this. This is really important.
Well, can I just say, I really enjoy this. I was on a Financial Times, and this might have been 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when Financial Times did I think it was their mining summit, They actually put something on for coal, and there was someone with an enormous amount of post-nominals on it, and was very, very clever. And I was told, obviously this was before, the conflict, I was told that, that effectively developed markets and Western Europe had solved the energy trilemma. And I think I thought that was really fascinating. And of course, my comment about that is I've never thought of the energy trilemma, affordability, reliability, security. I've never thought that is something you solve. I just always thought that was something that had to be in balance constantly and managed, and the eye on the ball. So I do think it's important that developed markets around the world actually remember the three basic principles for energy, which is affordability, reliability, and security. These are critical to economies, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean if you focus on that you're ignoring the environment. It does not mean that. So I think we have to go back to that.
I was thinking also, as you were talking there and answering Arjun's questions, there's an element to U.S., I'll speak from a U.S. perspective, U.S. national security, U.S. engagement with the developing world, where I think this is the theme I was hearing from you. If the U.S. would be focused on coal technology, be investing in coal technology, be helping the developing world with using the most advanced coal technology, that would not only be a good investment from a climate perspective, but that would obviously be a strategic connection with those countries that's very important to foreign policy and security. And the BRICS nations, the more we're getting away from coal and stopping talking about it and stopping investing in it, we're not only missing a chance to help the environment, but we're missing a chance to improve, national security. Is that
Yeah, I think that's a really fair assessment. And ultimately, all these nations want to be heard. They want the same opportunity that developed nations have had. And they're open to how that could be. It's in many ways, it's us as developed nations that have closed down that broader conversation. So, of course, if you can't have the broader conversation, you go to the people you can have it with. It is about respect. It's about respecting and understanding how the aspirations of these nations, and not being hypocritical in that approach. There's an enormous, the words that get carried around a lot are around hypocrisy, around that, the colonized way of thinking, the colonized thought. I mean, that's genuinely how people feel when they're engaged in those conversations. So when you're in South Africa, when you're in India, when you're in China, when you're in any of the emerging developing markets that would like to use coal power to advance their aspirations, both economically, and would like to use the technologies that allow them to do that legitimately, but find it really difficult to convince finance and investment in traditional markets why that should be the case, then you're effectively opening up different relationships and different opportunities for them, which then I guess you sit there and think, oh, well, why are we not involved? And the reason is because we shut down that conversation.
And not to pick on them, I know we're kind of getting towards the end of our time here with you, but the World Bank and those types of organizations that have become, they're kind of central to that topic that you were just touching on, which is letting the rest of the world, not letting, but helping the rest of the world get the energy they want and not being prejudicial on what flavors they can have through the World Bank. Is there a real reform or a chance to really change places like the IMF or the World Bank, to change those philosophies, to really, would that be almost the first thing you do if you were trying to solve some of these attitudes, is to fix how those organizations feel about energy and coal in particular?
Yeah, look, 100%. Like it really belies logic that those organizations aren't actually all about sustainable development. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is really, really clear. If you were following that as an investment case, you'd make an investment in abated coal, in any form of sustainable coal stewardship. That's the investment case for those multilateral banks.
Yes.
That's it. It's so let's go back. Let's go back to the very goals that they created. Let's make that the investment case for these nations. And let's start funding the real opportunities. That might be coal, it might be something else. It depends. Different courses, different horses. Like, it's not, certainly from our perspective, from FutureCoal's perspective, we're not here saying coal is the solution for everything. We're just saying it's still necessary. And it's got a legitimate place, and it can legitimately participate.
Fantastic. Can I ask one favor of you as you leave us? Since you've already been so generous with us, I'm asking for one more. You made this great comment about the definition of abatement, and that it doesn't mean just CCUS, that it has would you give us a better, or your definition of abatement? Because I think that's a great concept, and it's one we want to share with our audience. What's a better way to think of the definition?
Well, I think we just got to go back to the definition, the scientific definition of abatement, which is to really reduce emissions, right? To reduce any kind of reduction is really important, whether you achieve that through waste management, efficiency, all of these things, emissions control, all of these things are important contributors to abatement. And I think it's quite important that we broaden the definition to allow people to get on the journey of net zero. And I think that, that's really the key. Again, if you go back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, energy efficiency is actually really a key goal in there. So why does efficiency and energy efficiency, why does that not appear in any definition of abatement? And so we've talked about, the technologies that allow coal to really participate in that. So look, we just think it's important not to lean into really anything that's been redefined. It's really important just to go back to what's factual and unemotional. And when we're looking at abating something, we're looking at reducing its impact. So what are those things that help us do that? And the solutions for coal could be many across the value chain.
Just tremendous, Michelle. We can't thank you enough. As you were saying that, it's like you were saying, abatement doesn't mean zero emissions. Abatement just means an improvement. And let's focus on improvement. Well, I hate to let you go because this has been so fun. Please come to Houston and see us, and let's have some discussion here. We'll invite all our friends. Let's talk about what's happening in coal and how to make it better, and just all this whole conversation. We'd love to help you advance these notions, because they're very important, and we really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Talk soon.